Good morning. How are we all today? That's good. We've all recovered well from last night, which is good to see. I hope that you had a really good time. And for those of you who weren't able to be at dinner or didn't come, I hope enough of the chitter-chatter this morning is encouraging you to make sure that you come next year. And also, thank you very much for your very full attendance in the concurrent sessions this morning. It's been fabulous. So before getting started with our final plenary session today, I want to thank Colin Hunter Jr. for warmly welcoming us to country at the beginning of our conference. Today, I wish to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung peoples, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to all First Nations people here with us today. If you were at dinner tonight, you would have experienced the wonder of the Jiri Jiri group sharing their culture with us through story, music and dance, and it was a goosebump moment for me. Thanks to all those who got up and danced the dance of the Jiri Jiri with them, and that's the dance of the Willy Wagtail if you didn't know. So today we've already been enriched in our knowledge with a fine collection of our concurrent sessions, and I thank you all for your participation. So we are gathered in the room today, a very full room, for our conversation with Grace Tame. We are just going to have a conversation, and that's the way that Grace wanted to roll with this. So hopefully I can do that justice. So come on up, Grace. Okay? Whichever one you like. It's lovely to have you with us, Grace. It's very... As you can see, we have a very full room, a lot of people eagerly anticipating the conversation with you today. So Grace and I have had a bit of an opportunity to catch up before today, which of course makes perfect sense, doesn't it? And I wanted to start the conversation in a particular way, and so therefore I have asked Grace her permission to read a bit of an extract from her book by way of introduction, and that's to start at the point where most of you have come probably to know Grace in your lives, and that was when she was appointed Australian of the Year. So thank you for giving me permission to read from your book, and I'll just read a couple of paragraphs from there.
It's all right. My publishers will be stoked.
So this is in Grace's words. While I could not be prouder, more honoured or more grateful to be the first public survivor of child sexual abuse to be named Australian of the Year, there's something I must tell you. It was a beautiful moment in history that night, one that was shared with so many, a necessary moment at that, which above all was symbolistic, empowering and hopeful of what is to come. It was simultaneously one of the loneliest moments of my life, because the one person who couldn't be there to share it with me was me when I was a child. She was hidden from everyone's view. My cousin Millie had handwritten me a letter. I read it in my hotel room while Max was fast asleep. It was 2:00 in the morning. My phone was aglow and flashing on the bedside table beside me, messages coming in thick and fast. I had 2 hours, they said, until I had to be downstairs in the lobby, until my life wasn't mine again. I didn't know what was going on. I couldn't see the end of the day ahead. In those final moments of silence, I found myself, the 15-year-old girl in her uniform, and I sat with her. I held her. I cried. I was 26 then, still fighting my womanhood, without a period and terrified. I didn't sleep or do my hair. I just changed my clothes. I put my mask back on before I made my way to reception, onto the press bus, to Parliament House, and into your living rooms. I know, that was hard reading. That
Made myself cry.
So Grace, the key thing I turned to there is, what was the turning point? When did you go from someone fighting for the right to be heard to being an advocate for others?
First of all, I just want to thank you for having me here in the room. It's great to be here, and thank you all for the work you do. People who work in child protection, you guys are the lifeblood of our communities. You can make or break a child's life. So sincerely, as someone who's, been through a lot, I know how valuable the connections that you make with kids are. It's a really important question that you've put to me about the turning point, especially because advocacy in this space is not linear, and it's not black and white, and it's not quite that simple as something happening in a vacuum that you have this sudden epiphany and then you set forward on a very clear path. It was a lot more complicated than that. But I think I need to just provide some context around the letter from my cousin Millie that I was reading that night. My cousin Millie is 5 months younger than me. We look very alike. We're still very close. My mother is one of 5 girls, well, 9 technically, but she's got 4 older full sisters, and between the sisters there's 11 of us cousins, 8 of us are girls. We're all very close. And for a lot of our childhood, we all lived in 7 Mile Beach, where my dad still lives. He's at the back of the room down there. There's a sort of a really strong bond that we have. But Millie was there at the time of the abuse in 2010. And in fact, Millie was also abused by Nicholas Bester, not penetratively, but she was groomed online. He had many fake Facebook profiles that he used to arrange meetings, to groom, to keep contact, surveil us, and she was essentially recruited because he saw her as being valuable in his scheme to access me and also to use to his advantage more broadly. So reading that letter was, I don't know how to explain that, because it's the projection of that moment that was so public. It's all over national television, relentless media, was so different to the reality that I was living and had lived up to that moment and would live going forward through that turbulent time. And to go back in time to the moment when this sort of began, the advocacy, you'd have to go back to 2017. I was living in the United States at the time. I moved there when I was 18 to get some anonymity, to get out of the small town environment from Hobart. It's everyone knows everyone, and at the time the abuse was reported on, there wasn't a lot of conversation rumbling around things like grooming or even child sexual abuse. It was still very taboo, and the version of events that was printed in the paper was very problematic, and it was a fallacy. It was that it was an affair, even though my cousin Millie did give a statement. She and I were both put in the bath with this man, and there were lots of other horrendous details about really the sadistic torture that he subjected me to, locking me in a cupboard and doing quite awful things. That didn't make it in. It was a very whitewashed version, and in fact I was portrayed as a quote-unquote willing participant, which is language we still unfortunately hear today about children who are abused. So I wanted to get out of that. I wanted to get out of that environment. I moved overseas at 18, went to a community college in Santa Barbara in California for a couple of years. Lovely place, but I was still reeling from this trauma which I didn't quite understand. there wasn't access to information about these topics like there is now, because it's become such a big part of the zeitgeist. And so I felt very isolated by that. I didn't have a concept of grooming. I wouldn't learn the word grooming until 2017. And because of that, I didn't have the building blocks. I had a pretty turbulent few years over in the US. There were more traumas that unfolded that fed into this big sort of coagulation of dysregulation. And I ended up getting married very young to a man who came from a pretty traumatic background himself. And of course, as we know, trauma sparks trauma. There was a lot of alcohol and prescription drugs that fed into our relationship. We definitely were trauma bonded. And that was a hard time. He was a violent alcoholic. I witnessed his own mother slap him in the face. And there's that pipeline of abuse that you can see. He didn't have any other, or didn't have many strong models in his life. I would just got to clarify, I would put him in a different category to a calculating child sex offender who knows what they're doing and who plans their scheme. But it was a really turbulent time. And there was a lot of controversy back home in Australia that was sort of apart from my experience, and that was to do with the child sex offender being awarded a federally funded PhD scholarship to study at the University of Tasmania after he had come out of prison for serving time for both the crimes against me and for possessing child exploitation material. And my mother, who hadn't been to university until that point, was also on that campus. And this offender also reoffended while he was studying his PhD by boasting online about what he did to me. He threatened to sue me, he threatened to sue the courts, he described in lurid detail the abuse itself. He said, based on all the emails and tweets I've received, I'm one of the most envied men in Australia for getting to do what I did to that 15-year-old girl. It was awesome. Now, my mother argued, very justifiably, that this conduct must have contravened the university's code of conduct. But the university disagreed and defended him. So that was the source of the controversy in 2017. And that drew the attention of Australian media, in particular a journalist by the name of Nina Fennell, who's from New South Wales, who created and still runs the hashtag Let Her Speak and hashtag Let Us Speak campaigns. So she was drawn to Mum's story first, and then of course behind that was this broader story of child sexual offending, which ended with me, by the way. It didn't start with me. We're talking about a serial offender. As you probably know, for every known victim, there's often about 30 others. I've now met several other victims of this man. He was at my high school for 20 years before I reported him. And so that was that first turning point, I suppose, is that there was a journalist who came onto the scene interested in telling this bigger picture. And it was around that time that I was also put in touch with a man named Steve Fisher, who was abused in the church. And Steve was actually the first Tasmanian child sexual abuse survivor to ever share his story publicly. He had to get a court order in 2001 because at that time, up until 2020, there was a prohibitive law that prevented survivors of child sexual abuse from self-identifying, even if they gave their consent to tell their story under their own name after turning 18. So I was put in touch with Steve, who kind of was my advocate, my first advocate. And he was the first survivor of child sexual abuse that I really ever spoke to openly, because I hadn't spoken about that at this stage. It was 7 years after the offending. And speaking to Steve was the first time that I learnt the word grooming. And I looked it up online and I was mortified, angry, but also validated. And if there's to be any turning point in my advocacy, I would say it was that moment. I remember it as clear as day, feeling confronted, but also legitimised. And I thought to myself, well, knowledge is power. I have to share this pattern, which was so on point, with people, because we seem to understand that child rape is bad, that molestation is wrong, and yet this whole scheme of coercion that doesn't just apply to the victim, but to everyone in the network, whether it's colleagues or the victim's network, their family and friends, this needs to be known about, because this is how we can stop it from happening to others.
So Grace, you describe yourself as, on the webpage, you're described as an advocate, an activist and a survivor. Are you all three equally, or does it interchange between those depending on where you are in life?
It's a long time since I've seen that webpage. I would describe myself as many other things. I was quite delighted the other day. I was at the supermarket at the self-service checkout, and there was a woman next to me who had an 8-year-old son in a Spider-Man outfit. And I thought, I want to be that Spider-Man. But it was really lovely because she turned to her son and she said, oh, do you know this person? And I thought, oh, she's going to say, you know, it's something to do with child sexual abuse or something, or you know, the safe version of explaining that to an 8-year-old, you know, about advocacy or something. And she just said to him, she's a really fast runner. And I thought that was really special, because one of the things that I have been very conscious of doing as an advocate for fellow survivors of child sexual abuse is reminding people that we're just people. You know, I don't have to be a survivor, I don't have to be a victim, it's not about that. This is a really ubiquitous crime. We often hear about the statistics. The Australian Childhood Maltreatment Study that was released last year reported that it's 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys that is abused before the age of 18. And that's probably an underreported statistic, because shame and stigma are still very pervasive forces in our society. And there's a really high level of perpetration as well. At the end of last year, the University of New South Wales conducted an anonymous survey of child sexual offending behaviours and attitudes among Australian men, which is the biggest that's been conducted globally. It was the first of its kind in Australia, a nationally representative study, and it found that 1 in 10 Australian men has committed an offence against a child. And that's where we can start to complete this picture now, because we've heard a lot about victimisation, but we don't often hear a lot about perpetration and the behaviours and attitudes that go along with that. They found that 2/3 of that offending was actually online, and which signals that this normalisation through forces like technology is a really big problem that we have to address as well.
So when you're educating people about eradicating child sex abuse, what do we know about the perpetrators of that abuse? You have spoken about your own experience and the learning around grooming and so forth, but this is very much front and centre of your work with the foundation. So what's the message that you want to leave with the audience here today about that?
That it's a much more complicated picture than certainly mainstream media communicates to us. And, you know, that's to the detriment of the rest of the community, because we need to understand that this is a really complicated issue, nuanced issue, that without the full picture we can't address it properly. Child sexual offending covers a broad spectrum. You've got children who offend against other children, who engage in harmful sexual behaviours. Then you've got, at the other end of that spectrum, your sadistic, recidivist, calculating offender who, in my opinion, but also this is backed by evidence, can't be redeemed, and they have no interest in being redeemed. You might pathologise them as being in some ways psychopathic, Machiavellian, and they offend more broadly. So a lot of child sex offenders who are convicted often have criminal backgrounds in other areas. They're often known to commit fraud and other offences that actually enable their offending or enable them to evade justice. So there's a huge spectrum there. But what the University of New South Wales study of child sexual offending behaviours and attitudes found was that there was a general portrait of what these so-called undetected offenders look like and behave like. It found that the majority of people who commit offences against children, compared with people who don't, are well educated, they're earning a decent income, they're socially supported, they're older, male, Caucasian, they're frequent internet users and intensive internet users, and they're 2 to 3 times more likely to be working with children. So you will find them in places like schools, sporting institutions, and other careers that give them access to children. Now, this is really precious material. It's inescapable evidence that we've been provided with by this study, because we've heard a lot about the survivor's experience, but because of unfortunate trends like thinking that children are unreliable witnesses, and even survivors themselves in adulthood are unreliable witnesses. It's like all of these testimonies that we've heard from the survivor community that have evidenced this about what child sex offenders are like hasn't been taken seriously. Well, now we've got the official confessional from this offender base that hopefully, when married with the survivor's experience, closes those gaps in our understanding, and helps us realise that this is actually a preventable thing.
Here we've got a room of people that work in a space where they are working with children that are often in quite vulnerable positions. Not always at the really... Yeah, they are. But they are just people. They are just people too, as you were saying earlier. And so I suppose one of the things, or a curiosity for me really is from your perspective, what are the characteristics of a child's relationship with an adult that can provide the right environment to enable them to disclose they're being abused?
Well, that's a really tough one. You may very well have had the experience of being disclosed to by a child, and you've got to treat every person, I think, this is how I approach interactions, on a case-by-case basis. It's going to be, a matter of meeting that child where they're at. But safety is key. Safety and feeling understood. If a child has been sexually abused, and especially if they have been groomed, they will feel like it is their fault. That's the whole point of grooming, to make the child feel like they're complicit in the harm that has been caused to them. They will have very damaged trust. So to repair that takes a lot of work. But for children, relationships are life and death, because children are dependent on adults to model behaviour, to teach them lessons about the world, and to provide their basic needs. But you know all this stuff. Children are still developing neurologically and physically and socially. So there's a lot of responsibility, pressure, but yeah, providing safety and that sense that that child is understood, even if they've got a really complicated history that they're struggling to understand and communicate themselves.
Thank you. In your book, it's not quite dog-eared, but I've certainly given it a thorough going over and so forth, and also looked at a lot of other interviews and material and so forth that you've done over your very short life, really, Grace. That you've achieved so much in your years. But in your book, you do say that there are times that you've had to pull yourself out of some really dark places. And so what gives you your strength, your drive, your determination to keep going?
It's a good question. My dad and I were talking about this earlier. I have the great privilege of getting to meet a lot of survivors of childhood sexual abuse, but childhood maltreatment more broadly. And one of the things that I think is a privilege that I have experienced is love. I think that's the ultimate privilege. I think that's the point of life, to connect with others, and to share experiences. That's what we take with us to the grave, right? So, you know, even though I had some pretty horrific stuff that happened to me, I had a strong foundation of love and respect, good behaviour models, like my dad, like my mum. And even though they've separated when I was 2 years old, they've got some really core values that they share, you know, and that's treating people with respect. It's a good diet, access to exercise, you know, going outdoors, and grounding in really simple, meaningful values that I think are too often overlooked today, especially in this very digitally dependent world that we have that really has disconnected a lot of us from family and community values. So that was something that I had to fall back to. Whereas a lot of children, as we know, especially if they're abused much younger, and depending on their background, there's no other frame of reference. They don't have that foundation of support and love and care that they can return to. So I'm lucky that I can draw strength from those key relationships and from things like running. Love to run, and I love to be creative, and I love to listen to music. It's things like that. And then also I think it's important to remind people that some days you do not have to be strong. It is okay not to, you don't have to wallow in self-pity, but it's okay to just go, today's a shit day. I have a shit day. So that's part of your strength as well, is having respect for yourself and what you need in the moment.
We haven't had much of a chance to talk about your foundation in depth, and we probably are going to run out of time. But I know that one of the key things that you were advocating for that's come to fruition was in January this year, the Attorney General announced the inquiry into justice responses to sexual violence, and that'll be conducted by the Australian Law Reform Commission. So you were instrumental in getting that up, so congratulations. That's a big win in itself. So what do you hope will come about through that process? It doesn't report till, I think, January of 2025, so there's plenty of opportunity for people in this room to engage as well. But what is it that you hope will come about at the end of that?
My goodness. Well, the review is into justice responses to sexual abuse more broadly. I think one of the key things is recognising that child sexual abuse is a crime in a class all of its own, and that the child's voice really needs to be elevated. And to understand those key differences between adult-on-adult offending and adult-on-child offending that's prosecuted through the justice system, whether that be in the civil or criminal courts. And the family court is its own soup of a jurisdiction that needs to be reformed on many fronts. But I think that would be my aim, is for finally, a realisation to take hold that child sexual abuse is a particularly egregious crime where, it's not isolated to that incident of offending, just like in the case of adults offending against other adults, but there's a particularly deep and distinct imprint that is made on the psyche of a developing human that will result in very specific outcomes later in life. Developmental problems, autoimmune problems. We don't often, or we don't enough, view child sexual abuse through the lens of intergenerational trauma, the science of offending against a child. And that, I think, is crucial.
It certainly is, and we very much look forward to it. So thank you, and thank you, Grace, for giving me the privilege of having the conversation with you today. So once again, everybody, please thank Grace for being here.